Hello. In this video, we are doing part three, which is getting the player to move. So this is something that would happen as part of the game scene. So we'd want to identify where that function for the game scene is happening. So when I click here, we see that there's these curly braces here. So the main parts of how we're going to do this is using the on key down function. So we see how that works. You can check out the Kaboom.js website. So we basically want it to be so that the player can move left and right, but that's it. So we'd want to use one of the key handlers for that. All right, so when it comes to the key handlers, we have on key press, on key down. So on key down is what we want because it will keep happening as you hold down the button. So that's more like what we want for the left and right movement. That's different from like a jump using the space bar. That'd be on key press for the as you start to press the key. Now we want on key down for this. So like we can see in the example, we just say what key is being pressed and then the callback function um, to make something happen, like have our player move. All right, so I'm going to just place my cursor here before the ending of the game scene and just define on key down. The on key down function, and then just takes in two parameters. The first one is a string for pressing a certain letter or a key. So I'm going to say left. In this example, I'm going to use the left and right arrow keys. So when the left key is pressed, comma, then I'll put the arrow function, parens, arrow, curly braces, for what actually happens. And then what should happen? Well, the player should move to the left. So I do have a variable for player. I can't always just straight up say this, but I do have a variable for player here. Const and let are the two keywords that we've been using to make variables. So I can say player dot, and then there's a move function. And then in there, I just say how much in the X and how much in the Y. Well, 0, I should have something for the X actually. So let's just for now say like -300. Comma 0. I do not want, when I press the left key, to move at all in the Y direction. So see as that goes. It's a little hard to see with my player, so it moves like crazy, but it does move. All right, so what I would like to do is start to use variables here. So for this here, instead of it being a number like that, I would like to just make a variable. Is another way I could go about doing this, but I think I'd rather just do it this way. All right, so I'll make it a variable of my in the game scene. Before I define const player, this seems like a good spot to say const speed, maybe, equals 300. And sometimes I would tend to capitalize it if it really is going to be a constant like this. And then maybe I would just stick with my convention of making it lowercase letters. But because this is just going to be a straight up constant, I'll use the convention of capitalizing everything here. So now I have a variable. So instead of saying that player.moves -300, then I can just say negative speed. So I can use that variable. That will just help my code be a little more flexible. All right. So I'll do that. Just basically copy and paste for moving to the right. So on key down with the right key, this arrow function, the player should move in the X component positive speed. That way, if I ever want to change the speed, I'm just using a variable here. All right, so I can see what that looks like, although it is a little hard to see. Oh, so I can move left and right. Now I still have it in this version where my player is like behind the aliens, so it'd be good for us to think about that when I add the player component. Let's make the position lower on the page. So I could think about what these numbers are. I can always use some functions though. So if I want the X position to be maybe halfway in the screen, well, I can use the width function, parentheses there, and then divide by 2. Well, that will place it in the middle of the screen. And then how far down in the Y should it be? Well, I could pick a number, or I could also use the height function and subtract 50 or something like that. So that the Y would be really far down, however far the height is, but just a little bit less than that. So it will bring it back up. So that will put my player down here. So my player shows up down at the bottom there, and it can move left and right. Yep, so that has the player moving. And we might also want to think about the problem that the player can just completely move off screen. So a way that we could handle this is thinking about, okay, when I press on the left arrow key, right now I'm just saying player moves. Maybe I need to prevent that from happening if the player's in the wrong position. So that's exactly what an if statement would be for. Only if the player is really allowed to move, then should it move. So I'm going to use an if statement for that player moves. So on key down left. So if 3 greater than 2, curly braces, just to get my if statement started here. Because player moving is what I want to only sometimes happen. Not just if I press the left key, but if I press the left key and it's allowed to move here. And I should only be able to move if the player is still like inside of the game. Because if it's not, then it shouldn't be able to move any farther. So I'd like to be able to say something like X is smaller than something, or rather that X is greater than 0, probably. Like, why should I be able to move to the left? Well, as long as I'm still inside of the screen and not negative X position. Because if X was less than 0, then um, I shouldn't be able to move any farther to the left. So let's just see what this does, because it is going to throw an error. All right, so it's going to say X is not defined. So, is it player.x or something like that? So it just turns out that this is what we have to type, because there is no X variable. Suppose we could make it, but that's going to be a little tricky. And we might hope that we could say, oh, player.x. All right, and it at least doesn't get angry at us. But it didn't work. So it just turns out that it's player.pause.x. So we'll just start to learn that anytime we want to think about the x and the y position of any of these objects, we have to say something like player.pause.x. There's that pause component, stands for position, and then that contains an x and a y. That the pause is that thing altogether. I think I can show you in the documentation what that looks like. So you get this pause component here that itself contains an X and a Y in it. Now that those two numbers would be passed in. All right, so that will at least prevent the player from erroneously moving off the screen to the left. Yep, so my player, I can't move it any farther, so I'll repeat for moving to the right. So an if statement where, and I'm just going to type it, if player.pause.x is less than like 400, but I'm going to say width function with parentheses. If the player's x is still small enough that I'm like still on the screen, then that's where the curly braces come in. And the player.move goes inside those curly braces there. All right, so only when should I be able to move? Well, only if my player is still in the screen. If the x is still small enough, less than the width of the game. And I might want to tweak this just a little bit because I can kind of go off the screen at first. But if you really test it, you can see how I'm not going too far off. So with these images, it's the left-hand side of the player that's when we say pause.x, it's the left side of it. So I could really try to think about that and have the width of it. But Kaboom actually gives us this really nice feature where when we make the player in the first place, we can actually change where that hitbox is. So I'm going to add another component. So after area, but I needed to click on to do a comma there. So I can set the origin function, which I think we've used before. And I'll set the origin to the center. That way it's calculating where's the middle of this player. Well, now it's actually thinking about it as being in the center of it, not like something that starts on the left side. All right, so that'll make my getting stuck on the left side just a little bit different. But now that starts to see more like what we're looking for. And then the hitbox is, still looks like that. But when we talk about the X and the Y position, it's going to feel a little bit more comfortable. Okay, so that lets our player move.